Listen carefully, Western mining companies. I just nationalized Burkina Faso's gold mines, and from the ruins of your corporate exploitation rises African wealth you can never steal again. You thought mining concessions signed with corrupt predecessors meant permanent rights to extract our gold while leaving us poor. You believed Burkina Faso would remain your resource colony forever, digging wealth from our soil and shipping it to your shareholders. You were catastrophically wrong. I terminated every exploitative mining contract. I seized control of every major gold mine. I redirected billions in revenue from your profits to Burkina Faso's development. Your century of theft ended. Your licenses are canceled. Your operations are nationalized. This is your final warning to every foreign mining company bleeding profit from Africa. Accept fair partnerships where Africa controls resources and captures majority of revenues, or watch us nationalize your operations across all 54 African nations. We own the gold under our soil. We will extract it, process it, and profit from it ourselves. Try to punish us with sanctions and we'll sell our gold to China, Russia, and Gulf states who don't lecture us about investment climates. Africa's resources fund Africa's future now. Your era of resource colonialism ended the day I nationalized Burkina Faso's mines. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I inherited a country rich in gold but desperately poor in everything else. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's largest gold producers, extracting approximately 60 tons annually, worth over $3 billion at current prices. We have massive gold deposits across our territory, particularly in the north and east. Our soil contains wealth that should make every Burkina Faso citizen prosperous. Instead, most of our population lives in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2 per day. Our children die from preventable diseases because we lack basic health care. Our schools operate without adequate teachers, books, or facilities. Our roads are barely passable. Our electricity reaches only a fraction of our territory. We have gold worth billions, but live like we have nothing. The contradiction wasn't accidental. It was the intentional result of how gold mining was structured in Burkina Faso before I took power. Foreign mining companies, primarily Canadian, Australian, and British firms, controlled virtually all large-scale gold production. They operated under mining codes and contracts negotiated with previous governments that gave them absurdly favorable terms. The companies paid minimal royalties to Burkina Faso's government, typically just 3 to 5% of revenues. They received massive tax exemptions for their first years of operation and generous deductions afterward. They imported equipment duty-free. They repatriated profits without restrictions. They employed few Burkina Faso workers relative to their scale, bringing in foreign managers and technical staff instead of training locals. The mining contracts also included stability clauses that locked in these favorable terms for decades. Even if Burkina Faso changed its mining laws to demand better terms from new projects, existing mines operated under old agreements that couldn't be modified without company consent. The stability clauses meant that corrupt or incompetent governments from decades ago had signed away Burkina Faso's rights to fairly tax and regulate its own resources for generations. We were trapped in exploitative contracts that previous leaders had accepted, probably in exchange for bribes deposited in Swiss bank accounts. I studied the numbers carefully after taking power in January 2022. Foreign mining companies extracted approximately 60 tons of gold annually from Burkina Faso. At average gold prices around $60,000 per kilogram, that represented $3.6 billion in gross value. The companies claimed their costs were high, around 40 to 50% of gross value, leaving roughly $1.8 to $2.2 billion in operating profits. Burkina Faso's government received approximately $180 to $220 million annually from all mining revenues, royalties, and taxes combined. That was roughly 10% of the value being extracted from our soil. The foreign companies captured 90% of the value while Burkina Faso received 10%. And that 10% had to fund our entire government because we had few other significant revenue sources. Our agricultural economy generated minimal tax revenue. We had little industry beyond mining. Foreign aid had been substantial but came with conditions that constrained our sovereignty. The mining revenues should have been enough to transform Burkina Faso, but receiving only 10% of the value, while foreigners took 90%, meant we remained poor despite being resource-rich. I calculated what Burkina Faso could do with the $1.8 to $2.2 billion in mining profits that foreign companies were repatriating annually. We could build comprehensive healthcare system reaching every village. We could construct thousands of schools and train tens of thousands of teachers. We could pave roads connecting our entire country. We could electrify every community. We could fund agricultural development programs that would double or triple farmer incomes. We could invest in industries that would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. The money being extracted by foreign mining companies was exactly what Burkina Faso needed to escape poverty and build a prosperous future. But getting that money required breaking the exploitative contracts that previous governments had signed. The mining companies would claim their contracts were legal and binding. International investment treaties would give them standing to sue Burkina Faso in international arbitration forums if we violated contract terms. Western governments would pressure us to respect property rights and honor agreements. International financial institutions would warn that nationalizing mines would destroy our investment climate and cut us off from foreign capital. The entire international system was designed to protect foreign investors' rights over host countries' development needs. I decided the international system's rules were illegitimate because they were written by powerful countries to serve their interests, not African development. The mining contracts were signed by governments that didn't represent Burkinabe people's interests, and often personally benefited from selling our resources cheaply to foreign companies. The investment treaties were negotiated under pressure when African countries were desperate for any foreign investment and had no bargaining power. The international arbitration systems were dominated by Western lawyers and arbitrators who consistently ruled in favor of foreign investors over African governments. None of it was designed to be fair. It was designed to enable continued extraction of African resources on terms favorable to foreign capital. I began planning how to nationalize Burkina Faso's mines and restructure our gold sector to benefit our people rather than foreign shareholders. This required careful strategy because the mining companies would resist fiercely, Western governments would pressure me to back down, and international financial consequences could be severe if I miscalculated. But the alternative was accepting permanent poverty while foreigners extracted our wealth, and that was unacceptable. I started by studying how other countries had nationalized their resource sectors. I examined Bolivia's nationalization of natural gas under President Evo Morales, which had successfully transferred control from foreign companies to Bolivian state while maintaining production. I looked at Venezuela's oil nationalization, which had achieved resource sovereignty but faced severe consequences from international opposition. I studied historical examples from 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds when many developing countries nationalized foreign-owned industries during decolonization. Some nationalizations succeeded in transferring wealth and control to local populations. Others failed catastrophically when foreign companies sabotaged operations, Western powers imposed devastating sanctions, and governments lacked technical capacity to operate complex industries. The lessons from historical nationalizations were clear. Success required having technical capacity to operate mines after foreign companies left or were expelled. It required having alternative markets for our gold if Western buyers boycotted nationalized production. It required having financial resources to compensate foreign companies, at least partially, to reduce international legal exposure. It required having political will to withstand intense pressure from companies, Western governments, and international institutions. Most importantly, it required having popular support domestically so that foreign pressure couldn't destabilize the government politically. I began building the necessary preconditions for successful nationalization. First, I directed Burkina Faso's Ministry of Mines to conduct comprehensive assessment of our gold sector. How many mines were operating? Which companies owned them? What were exact contract terms? How much gold was being extracted? What were real production costs versus inflated figures companies claimed? How much technical expertise did we have domestically versus dependence on foreign personnel? The assessment took months but produced a detailed picture of exactly what nationalization would entail. The assessment revealed that 9 major gold mines operated in Burkina Faso, controlled by 6 foreign companies. The largest operations were controlled by Canadian companies including Endeavour Mining, Semafo, and IM Gold. British, Australian, and Russian companies controlled smaller operations. The mines employed approximately 8,000 workers directly, with perhaps 20,000 more in supporting industries and services. The foreign companies claimed they employed primarily Burkinabe workers, but assessment revealed that nearly all management positions and most technical roles were held by foreigners. Burkinabe workers filled labor positions but rarely advanced to roles with real authority or technical knowledge. The assessment also revealed that technical operations were less complex than foreign companies claimed. Modern gold mining is highly mechanized with sophisticated equipment, but the actual operations are manageable with competent engineering and technical staff. Burkina Faso had mining engineers, geologists, and technical specialists who had been trained at universities or had worked in mining industry. We lacked the depth of technical expertise that foreign companies brought, but we had foundation that could be built upon. With targeted hiring of African technical experts from neighboring countries and focused training programs, we could develop capacity to operate mines ourselves within months. Second, I began building alternative markets for Burkina Faso's gold if Western buyers boycotted our production after nationalization. I sent representatives to China, Russia, India, and United Arab Emirates to discuss gold sales. The response was enthusiastically positive. China's central bank was actively seeking to diversify its reserves away from dollar assets and was buying gold aggressively. Russia was expanding gold reserves as part of broader strategy to reduce Western financial system dependence. India had massive gold demand for jewelry and investment. UAE operated as gold trading hub and could facilitate sales to multiple markets. All of them would buy Burkina Faso's gold without conditions about investment, climate, or property rights. The alternative markets meant we weren't dependent on Western buyers. If London gold market refused to accept our gold, we would sell to Shanghai. If Swiss refineries wouldn't process it, we would ship to refineries in UAE or India. If Western banks wouldn't finance gold trade, we would work with Chinese banks. The multipolar global economy created options that didn't exist decades ago when Western markets dominated commodity trade. Our gold would find buyers regardless of Western opposition because it was physical, valuable asset that many countries wanted. Third, I began preparing Burkina Faso population politically for nationalization. I gave speeches about how foreign mining companies were stealing our wealth. I published data showing how little revenue Burkina Faso received compared to value being extracted. I invited people to visit mining communities and see how little benefit local populations received despite massive industrial operations nearby. I highlighted foreign workers living in luxury compounds while Burkina Faso miners earned poverty wages. I reminded people of colonial history when Europeans extracted African resources and left us poor. The messaging resonated powerfully because it connected to lived reality. Burkina Faso people could see massive mining operations but experienced no improvement in their living standards. They understood intuitively that something was wrong when foreign companies grew rich from our gold while we remained desperately poor. The nationalist narrative about reclaiming our resources from foreign exploitation built popular support that would be crucial for withstanding international pressure after nationalization. Fourth, I coordinated with leaders of other African countries who were interested in following similar path. I discussed nationalizations with presidents of Mali, Guinea, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, countries that had significant mining sectors dominated by foreign companies. Some were cautious about risks, but others were interested in coordinating efforts. If multiple African countries nationalized mining sectors simultaneously, it would be harder for Western powers and companies to isolate and punish any single country. The coordination would demonstrate this was African movement, not isolated action by radical government. By mid-2023, I had completed preparations and decided it was time to act. I scheduled announcement for September 2023, calculating that timing would maximize impact while minimizing risks. The announcement would come shortly after I had expelled French military forces and invited Wagner mercenaries, demonstrating consistency in my government's commitment to sovereignty and independence from Western control. The timing would also precede major international meetings where Western pressure would be applied, giving us time to consolidate nationalization before facing concerted opposition. On the 15th of September 2023, I addressed the nation of Burkina Faso in televised speech that would transform our country's economic future. I announced that the government was immediately nationalizing all major gold mines in Burkina Faso. The foreign companies' mining licenses were terminated. Their operations were seized under state control. New state mining company called Sonabim Société Nationale des Mines du Burkina would operate all nationalized mines going forward. The seizure was effective immediately, with military forces deployed to mines to ensure a smooth transition. I explained in the speech exactly why nationalization was necessary. Foreign mining companies had extracted over $30 billion in gold from Burkina Faso over the previous 2 decades, while paying us less than $3 billion in royalties and taxes. They had taken 90% of the wealth from our soil while leaving our people in poverty. The mining contracts were signed by corrupt governments that didn't represent our interests. The international investment system was designed to enable continued colonialism through economic means rather than direct political control. Burkina Faso was reclaiming sovereignty over our natural resources so that our gold would fund our development rather than foreign shareholders' dividends. I also announced that Burkina Faso would compensate the foreign mining companies for their investments, but at valuations we determined were fair rather than inflated figures companies claimed. We would pay for the equipment, infrastructure, and genuine capital investments the companies had made. We would not pay for projected future profits or imaginary damages from lost opportunities. The compensation would be paid over time, as our gold revenues allowed, not immediately, and it would be paid in our terms, not according to international arbitration decisions we didn't recognize as legitimate. The immediate reaction from foreign mining companies was shock, fury, and threats. Company executives called me directly, demanding I reverse the seizures. They claimed their contracts were legal and internationally recognized. They threatened to sue Burkina Faso in international arbitration forums. They warned they would seek asset seizures against Burkina Faso's property abroad to collect damages. They predicted that nationalization would catastrophically fail because Burkina Faso lacked technical capacity to operate modern mines. They claimed gold production would collapse, revenues would disappear, and our economy would be destroyed. I ignored every threat because the companies had no leverage once I had physical control of their mines. They could sue in international forums, but enforcing judgments against sovereign state is difficult, especially when that state has few foreign assets to seize. They could try to sabotage operations by refusing to provide technical support, but we had already hired African engineers and technical staff from neighboring countries to replace foreign personnel. They could lobby Western governments to pressure us, but I had already demonstrated willingness to defy Western pressure by expelling French forces and partnering with Russia. Western governments reacted with condemnation and warnings. Canadian government, whose mining companies were most affected, immediately protested the seizures. Canadian Foreign Minister called my action illegal expropriation that violated international law and investment treaties. Canadian government threatened to suspend aid to Burkina Faso and support mining companies' legal claims. Australian and British governments issued similar protests. The European Union expressed concern about rule of law and property rights. The United States warned that nationalizing foreign investments would isolate Burkina Faso from international financial system. I dismissed Western government protests as hypocritical interference. These same governments had supported nationalization when it happened in their own countries historically. The United States had seized British property during independence. European countries had nationalized industries after World War II, but when African countries sought to nationalize resources that Western companies were exploiting, suddenly it was violation of international law. The hypocrisy was transparent and demonstrated that Western commitments to property rights and rule of law were selective based on whose property and which laws were at issue. International financial institutions reacted with warnings about consequences for Burkina Faso's access to capital. The International Monetary Fund suspended discussions about potential financial assistance. The World Bank froze loans that had been under consideration. Western credit rating agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's debt rating. International banks that financed commodity trade indicated they wouldn't provide services for Burkina Faso's gold sales. The message from international financial system was clear. Countries that nationalize foreign investments will be punished through financial isolation. I had anticipated the financial system's response and prepared alternatives. China's Export-Import Bank offered to finance Burkina Faso's development projects at favorable terms. Russian banks indicated willingness to facilitate gold sales and provide trade financing. Gulf states' sovereign wealth funds expressed interest in investing in Burkina Faso's mining sector under state ownership. The alternatives weren't perfect substitutes for Western financial institutions, but they were adequate to avoid catastrophic isolation. We could finance our development and sell our gold without Western financial systems' approval. Mandatory rehook at 3,000 words. Listen carefully. Western mining companies, your operations are seized. Your contracts are terminated. Your century of theft from Burkina Faso's soil ended permanently. You thought international law and investment treaties would protect your exploitation. You believed we wouldn't dare nationalize because we needed Western capital and markets. You were humiliated completely. I took control of every major gold mine. I established Sonabim to operate them under Burkinabe control. I redirected $3 billion in annual revenues from your shareholders to our people's development. Your legal threats failed. Your government pressure failed. Your predictions of collapse failed. This is your escalating final warning. Mali is considering nationalizing its mines. Guinea is reviewing exploitative contracts. Tanzania is increasing state control. Every African country watching Burkina Faso's success will follow our example. Accept fair partnerships where you receive reasonable returns for actual services while Africa controls resources and captures majority of value, or watch us nationalize across all 54 nations simultaneously. We have Chinese buyers for our gold. We have Russian financing for our operations. We have Gulf investment for our development. Your monopoly on markets and capital is broken. Africa's resources belong to Africa now. Your era of resource colonialism ended the day I nationalized Burkina Faso's mines. Accept the new reality or lose access to African resources completely. The practical implementation of nationalization began immediately after my announcement. I had deployed military forces to all major mining sites on the day of the speech to ensure smooth transition and prevent any sabotage by foreign companies. Burkinabe soldiers secured mine facilities, equipment, and offices. Foreign management personnel were escorted off sites and given 48 hours to leave the country unless they wanted to remain as employees of Sonabim under Burkinabe supervision. Most foreign managers left rather than accepting loss of control and reduced compensation. The departing foreign personnel took knowledge with them but also created opportunities to promote Burkinabe workers who had been kept in subordinate roles under foreign management. I directed Sonabim to immediately promote the most competent Burkinabe employees to management positions. Mining engineers who had been limited to junior roles suddenly became mine managers. Geologists who had conducted surveys under foreign supervision now led exploration programs. Accountants who had prepared reports for foreign executives now controlled financial operations. The rapid promotions created steep learning curves, but they also demonstrated that Burkinabe people were capable of roles foreign companies had claimed only expatriates could fill. Sonabim also recruited technical expertise from across Africa to supplement domestic capacity. We hired experienced mining engineers from South Africa, Ghana, and Tanzania who brought skills developed in their own country's mining sectors. We recruited geologists and metallurgists from universities across the continent. We brought in equipment specialists and safety experts. The Pan-African recruitment demonstrated that Africa possessed collective technical capacity that eliminated dependence on Western expatriates. What Burkina Faso lacked individually, we could access through African cooperation. The first weeks of nationalized operations were challenging, but not catastrophic, as foreign companies had predicted. Gold production declined temporarily as new management learned operations and some technical issues required resolution. But production didn't collapse. The mines continued operating. Workers continued extracting and processing gold. Within a month, production had recovered to 80% of pre-nationalization levels. Within 3 months, we had reached 95%. The foreign companies' warnings that Burkina Faso couldn't operate modern mines proved false. The revenue transformation was immediate and dramatic. Under foreign ownership, Burkina Faso had received approximately $200 million annually from mining royalties and taxes, while companies repatriated $1.8 to $2 billion in profits. Under state ownership through Sonabim, all revenues came to Burkina Faso's government minus actual operating costs. Production costs remained around 40 to 50% of gross revenues as they had been under foreign ownership, but now the 50 to 60% operating margin belonged to us. We were receiving approximately $1.8 to $2.2 billion annually instead of $200 million. Our mining revenues increased tenfold overnight through nationalization. I directed the massive revenue increase toward development programs that would transform Burkina Faso within years. We launched comprehensive healthcare initiative building 500 new health clinics across rural areas that had never had medical facilities. We trained 2,000 nurses and 500 doctors through accelerated programs and recruited medical personnel from other African countries. We provided free healthcare for children under 5 and pregnant women. The health investments began saving lives within months as previously preventable diseases were treated and maternal mortality declined. We invested heavily in education, constructing 1,000 new schools and training 5,000 new teachers. We provided free primary education for all children and eliminated school fees that had prevented poor families from sending their children to school. We distributed textbooks, supplies, and meals to students. We built 10 new secondary schools and upgraded existing facilities. The education investments would take years to show full results, But enrollment increased immediately, as families who couldn't afford school costs now sent their children. We launched massive infrastructure program paving 2,000 kilometers of roads connecting major cities and agricultural regions to markets. We began electrification program extending power grid to villages that had never had electricity. We invested in telecommunications infrastructure, providing internet access to rural areas. We built water systems, delivering clean water to communities that had relied on contaminated sources. The infrastructure investments created construction jobs immediately while building foundations for long-term economic growth. We also invested in agricultural development programs providing subsidized fertilizer, improved seeds, and technical assistance to farmers. We built irrigation systems enabling year-round agriculture rather than dependence on rainy season. We constructed storage facilities reducing post-harvest losses. We created credit programs allowing farmers to invest in productivity improvements. The agricultural investments aimed to boost farmer incomes and reduce poverty for majority of population that depended on farming. The development programs were funded entirely from nationalized mining revenues without foreign aid or borrowing. We didn't need Western development assistance when we controlled our own resources. We didn't need IMF loans when our gold revenues generated sufficient capital. We didn't need World Bank projects when we could finance our own infrastructure. The economic sovereignty that came from resource sovereignty was transformative. For first time since independence, Burkina Faso's development was funded by Burkinabe resources under Burkinabe control, serving Burkinabe priorities. By mid-2024, less than a year after nationalization, the results were visible across Burkina Faso. Health clinics were operating in villages that had never had medical facilities. New schools were filled with children who had previously been unable to attend. Roads were connecting previously isolated communities. Villages were getting electricity for first time. Farmers were reporting higher incomes from improved seeds and techniques. The transformation wasn't complete, but the direction was undeniable. Burkina Faso was developing faster under resource sovereignty than in decades of dependence on foreign investment and aid. The success attracted intense interest from other African countries facing similar situations. Delegations from Mali, Guinea, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and other mineral-rich African countries visited Burkina Faso to study our nationalization model. They wanted to understand how we had overcome technical challenges, how we were managing operations, how we had avoided predicted collapse, and how we were using revenues for development. The interest demonstrated that Burkina Faso's success was inspiring broader African movement toward resource sovereignty. Mali announced in late 2024 that it was reviewing all mining contracts and considering nationalizing operations that didn't provide fair value to Malian people. Guinea's government declared it would renegotiate bauxite mining agreements to capture larger share of revenues from aluminum ore exports. Tanzania introduced new mining regulations requiring majority local ownership of large-scale operations. Zimbabwe moved toward nationalizing diamond mines that had been dominated by foreign companies. The pattern was spreading as African governments recognized that resource sovereignty was achievable despite foreign company threats and Western pressure. The mining companies and Western governments watched the spreading movement with alarm. If resource nationalism became African norm rather than isolated exception, Western companies would lose access to minerals and resources they depended on. The entire system of resource extraction that had enriched Western countries while keeping Africa poor would collapse. Western governments that had lectured about property rights and investment climates would face choice between accepting African resource sovereignty or attempting to coerce African governments into maintaining exploitative systems. Some Western officials argued for accepting new reality and negotiating fair partnerships rather than trying to preserve old exploitative arrangements. These officials recognized that African resource nationalism was a legitimate response to history of exploitation and couldn't be reversed through pressure. They advocated for Western companies offering genuine partnerships where African countries controlled resources and captured majority of value, while companies received fair compensation for services and expertise. The partnership approach might reduce Western company profits, but would maintain access to African resources and prevent complete Western exclusion. Other Western officials advocated aggressive responses to punish countries that nationalized Western investments and deter others from following. They pushed for comprehensive sanctions, exclusion from international financial system, support for mining companies' legal claims, and coordination of Western pressure campaigns. They believed that making nationalism costly enough would convince African governments that exploitation was better than isolation, and Western companies' dominant position could be preserved through coercion. The debate within Western governments remained unresolved because accepting African resource sovereignty meant acknowledging that post-colonial extraction system was ending, while aggressive punishment risked pushing African countries completely into Chinese and Russian orbits. The paralysis of Western policymaking created opening for African countries to consolidate resource sovereignty before Western powers developed effective responses. Meanwhile, I continued building Burkina Faso's state mining capacity to demonstrate that nationalization was sustainable long-term, not just initial success that would collapse. Sonabim invested in developing Burkinabe technical expertise through training programs, sending mining engineers and geologists for advanced education in South Africa, Ghana, and Morocco. We recruited experienced African mining executives to lead Sonabim and transfer knowledge to Burkinabe managers. We invested in modern equipment and technology, ensuring our operations remained competitive with international standards. We implemented safety and environmental standards that equaled or exceeded what foreign companies had maintained. Sonabim also began exploring and developing new gold deposits that foreign companies had identified but not developed. Under foreign ownership, companies had extracted easily accessible deposits while leaving more difficult or lower-grade ore untouched. Under state ownership with longer-term horizons, we could develop deposits that would expand our gold production beyond the 60 tons annually that foreign companies had achieved. We invested exploration budgets into identifying new deposits across Burkina Faso's gold-bearing regions. We developed plans for opening new mines that would increase production to 80 or even 100 tons annually within 5 years. The expanded production plans required capital investment that Sonabim funded from gold sales revenues. We didn't need foreign investment because our operating mines generated sufficient revenues to fund exploration, development, and expansion. The capital self-sufficiency meant Burkina Faso's mining sector development was entirely under our control, without dependence on foreign capital that could be withheld as political pressure. We controlled our resource development timeline and priorities, rather than accepting what foreign investors deemed profitable. I also began discussions with other African gold producers about coordinating production and marketing to maximize revenues. If African countries that controlled significant gold production, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, Tanzania, and South Africa, coordinated output and marketing strategies, we could influence global gold prices rather than being price takers who accepted whatever international markets offered. The coordination wouldn't create OPEC-style cartel because gold markets were more complex, and China and Russia were also major producers, but it would give African countries more market power than we had individually. The discussions about African gold coordination alarmed Western financial institutions because gold markets were crucial to international financial system. Western central banks held large gold reserves as monetary foundation. Major bullion banks facilitated gold trading that generated enormous profits. If African producers began coordinating to manipulate markets, it could disrupt carefully managed gold price stability that Western financial institutions depended on. The threat of African market power added another dimension to resource nationalism that went beyond single-country nationalizations. By early 2025, Burkina Faso's nationalization was consolidated and proving successful beyond what skeptics had predicted. Sonabim was operating efficiently with production levels matching foreign companies' previous performance. Revenues were funding transformative development programs visible across the country. Technical capacity was improving through training and African recruitment. No catastrophic collapse had occurred. Foreign companies' legal threats were proceeding through international arbitration but without practical impact on our operations. Western pressure had been intense but ineffective at forcing reversal. The success vindicated my decision to nationalize despite risks and criticism. Burkina Faso had reclaimed sovereignty over our most valuable resource. We had proven that African countries possess technical capacity to operate complex industries without permanent dependence on foreign companies. We had demonstrated that development could be funded from African resources under African control rather than requiring foreign aid and investment on Western terms. We had shown that international systems rules protecting foreign investors could be challenged successfully when countries had political will and alternative partnerships. Did nationalization solve all Burkina Faso's problems? No. Security challenges from jihadist insurgencies continued despite increased revenues funding military operations. Corruption remained a serious problem that redirected some mining revenues away from intended development purposes. Technical capacity gaps meant we still depended on foreign expertise in some areas even as we developed domestic capabilities. The rushed nationalization had created operational challenges that would take years to fully resolve. But the fundamental transformation from puppet state enriching foreign companies to self-reliant nation controlling its own resources was undeniable. The mining companies never accepted defeat gracefully. They pursued legal claims through international arbitration forums, seeking billions in compensation for expropriated investments. The arbitration proceedings would take years and possibly result in judgments against Burkina Faso, but enforcing those judgments required seizing Burkinabe assets abroad, and we had few such assets to seize. We had moved our gold sales to Chinese and Russian markets that wouldn't enforce Western arbitration judgments. We had minimized our engagement with Western financial system to limit exposure. The legal threats were annoying but not existential. Western governments continued pressuring me through diplomatic channels and international forums. They criticized Burkina Faso's investment climate at every opportunity. They blocked some international assistance programs. They attempted to organize coordinated sanctions. But the pressure was limited because Western powers needed African cooperation on other issues, including migration control, counterterrorism, and climate policy. Comprehensively isolating Burkina Faso would jeopardize Western interests in those areas. And other African countries were watching whether Western pressure on Burkina Faso succeeded, calculating whether they could risk similar nationalizations. France's reaction was particularly bitter because Burkina Faso's nationalization followed so soon after expelling French military forces. French officials saw a pattern of African rejection of French influence across economic, political, and security domains. French companies had dominated Burkina Faso's economy alongside mining operations that were mostly non-French. French fears about losing access to African resources and markets intensified. French warnings about African resource nationalism became increasingly shrill as other African countries began following Burkina Faso's example. The transformation across the Sahel demonstrated that African economic sovereignty could be achieved despite Western opposition. Mali's mining sector came under increasing state control. Niger reviewed its uranium contracts with French companies. Guinea renegotiated bauxite agreements. The pattern threatened an entire system of resource extraction that had enriched Western countries for centuries while keeping Africa poor. Western powers faced choice between accepting new reality of African resource sovereignty or escalating pressure to preserve extractive arrangements. The Chinese response to African resource nationalism was pragmatic acceptance, combined with offering alternative partnerships. Chinese companies proposed joint ventures with African state mining companies, where Chinese provided technology and access to Chinese markets, while African countries maintained majority ownership and control. Chinese government offered financing for mining sector development through Chinese banks. Chinese buyers welcomed African gold, copper, bauxite, and other minerals without conditions about investment, climate, or property rights. China's approach reflected recognition that African resource sovereignty was inevitable, and Chinese interests were better served by accommodating it than fighting it. Russia similarly offered partnership rather than opposition. Russian mining companies proposed technical cooperation agreements with African state companies. Russian banks facilitated resource trade outside Western financial system. Russia's experience with nationalizing its own oil and gas sector during 2000s gave Russian officials understanding that resource nationalism was legitimate exercise of sovereignty rather than violation of international norms. Russia's support for African resource sovereignty aligned with broader Russian strategy of challenging Western-dominated international order. Your legacy, Western mining companies, is loss of control over African resources and demonstration that your exploitation could be ended despite your legal claims and government backing. You built fortunes extracting African gold, copper, diamonds, and other minerals while leaving African populations in poverty. That system collapsed when African countries decided we would rather control our own resources even if it meant conflict with you. Your operations are nationalized. Your contracts are terminated. Your legal threats are ignored. Your government pressure failed. Your predictions of collapse were proven false. My legacy is Burkina Faso transformed from puppet state enriching foreign mining companies to self-reliant nation funding its own development from its own resources. I nationalized every major gold mine despite intense pressure from companies and Western governments. I established Sonabim as efficient state mining company proving African technical capacity. I redirected billions from foreign shareholders to Burkina Faso healthcare, education, infrastructure, and agriculture. I inspired continental movement toward African resource sovereignty that threatens Western access to minerals across the continent. History will remember who challenged resource colonialism and who defended it. The answer is written in nationalized mines across Burkina Faso, operating under African control. It's documented in development programs funded by mining revenues that previously enriched foreign shareholders. It's proven in spreading resource nationalism across Mali, Guinea, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and other African countries. It's demonstrated in transformed relationship between African countries and mining companies, where we increasingly control resources and dictate terms. You claimed foreign investment and mining company expertise were necessary for African development. We nationalized your investments and proved we could operate mines ourselves. You warned that nationalization would collapse our economy and isolate us internationally. We proved you wrong by maintaining production, finding alternative markets, and funding unprecedented development. You insisted that international law and investment treaties protected your right to extract our resources on exploitative terms forever. We showed that sovereign states can reclaim control over their natural resources regardless of contracts signed by corrupt predecessors. The proof is in transformed Burkina Faso, where mining revenues fund people's development rather than foreign dividends. Health clinics operating in villages that never had medical facilities. Schools educating children who couldn't previously afford enrollment. Roads connecting communities that had been isolated. Electricity reaching villages that had lived in darkness. Farmers earning higher incomes from improved seeds and techniques. The development funded entirely from our own resources under our own control. The outcome is permanent shift from puppet state to self-reliant nation. Foreign mining companies will not regain control over Burkina Faso's gold regardless of arbitration judgments or Western pressure. Sonabim will continue operating and expanding production under Burkina Faso control. Mining revenues will fund our development priorities rather than enriching foreign shareholders. Other African countries will follow our example, nationalizing resources and building state capacity to control their own wealth. The permanence isn't wishful thinking or temporary political rhetoric. It's structural reality, backed by capabilities, alternatives, and political will that make reversal practically impossible. Sonabim has proven technical capacity to operate mines at production levels matching foreign companies' performance. We've recruited and trained Burkina Faso engineers, geologists, and managers who gained expertise operating our mines. We've established relationships with equipment suppliers, technical service providers, and expert consultants from across Africa and beyond who support our operations without requiring ownership control. The technical capacity that foreign companies claimed was their unique value has been replicated and localized. Sonabim's financial performance demonstrates sustainability beyond initial nationalization success. Our operating costs per ounce of gold produced are comparable to what foreign companies achieved, disproving claims that state ownership would necessarily be inefficient. Our production costs average around $1,100 to $1,300 per ounce compared to international industry averages of $1,000 to $1,200. The slight premium reflects learning curves and deliberate choices to prioritize worker safety and environmental standards over pure cost minimization. But the costs are competitive enough that Sonabim generates substantial operating margins at current gold prices above $2,000 per ounce. The revenues transformed from trickle to flood. Under foreign ownership, Burkina Faso received approximately $200 million annually. Under Sonabim, we capture approximately $1.8 billion annually in operating profits after costs. That's 9 times more revenue from the same gold production. The ninefold increase came entirely from changing ownership structure, not from discovering new deposits or improving extraction technology. The foreign companies were taking 90% of the value and leaving us 10%. Now we keep 100% of the operating profits and use them for Burkina Faso priorities. The $1.8 billion in annual mining revenues represents approximately 20% of Burkina Faso's GDP and over 50% of government revenues. Mining has become foundation of our fiscal capacity, funding everything from healthcare to infrastructure to military operations. The dependence on mining creates vulnerability to gold price fluctuations, but it also provides resources that were unavailable when foreign companies controlled the sector. We're diversifying our economy using mining revenues to invest in agriculture, manufacturing, and services that will eventually reduce mining dependence. But for now, Gold revenues are engine driving Burkina Faso's transformation. Sonabim is also expanding production beyond levels foreign companies achieved. We're developing new deposits that foreign companies identified, but never exploited because projected returns didn't meet their profit thresholds. Under private ownership, deposits that would generate 15 to 20% annual returns weren't worth developing when companies demanded 25 to 30% returns. Under state ownership with different objectives, we develop deposits that will expand production and generate revenues for national development, even if returns are lower than private investors demanded. We're investing $300 million annually in exploration and development to open new mines across Burkina Faso's gold-bearing regions. The investment comes from Sonabim's operating profits, not from foreign capital, meaning we control the development timeline and priorities. We're targeting production increases from current 60 tons annually to 80 tons within 3 years, and potentially 100 tons within 5 years. The expansion will increase revenues proportionally, generating over $2.5 billion annually at 80 tons and over $3 billion at 100 tons. Those revenues will fund even more ambitious development programs. Foreign mining companies will not regain control because we've eliminated the mechanisms through which they might return. The old mining code that gave foreign companies favorable terms has been completely rewritten. The new code establishes that all mineral resources belong to Burkina Faso and can only be extracted under state control or joint ventures where state maintains majority ownership and control. The stability clauses that locked in old terms have been repudiated as agreements signed by corrupt governments without legitimate authority. International investment treaties that gave foreign companies arbitration rights have been terminated or renegotiated to eliminate investor-state dispute provisions. The legal infrastructure that enabled foreign control has been dismantled systematically. Future foreign companies that want to operate in Burkina Faso will do so as minority partners in joint ventures with Sonabim, providing technical services for fees rather than owning and controlling operations. They'll share technology and expertise in exchange for reasonable compensation, not extraordinary profits from resource ownership. The terms will be fair to both sides, but they'll reflect Burkinabe control over our resources rather than foreign ownership that left us with scraps. Western pressure to reverse nationalization has been intense, but ineffective because we anticipated it and prepared alternatives. When Western governments threatened aid cuts, we had already secured Chinese loans and Russian technical cooperation. When international financial institutions warned about isolation, we had already established relationships with alternative development partners. When mining companies filed arbitration claims, we had already moved our assets beyond Western courts' reach and shifted gold sales to markets that wouldn't enforce Western judgments. The arbitration proceedings launched by foreign mining companies are proceeding through International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes and other forums. The companies are claiming tens of billions of dollars in damages for expropriated investments, lost future profits, and destroyed business value. Their lawyers argue that Burkina Faso violated international law, breached treaty obligations, and engaged in illegal expropriation. The arbitration panels will likely rule in favor of the companies because these forums are dominated by Western arbitrators who consistently protect investor rights over sovereign state interests. But winning arbitration is different from collecting damages. Arbitration judgments must be enforced by national courts in countries where the losing party has assets. Burkina Faso has minimal assets in Western jurisdictions that could be seized. Our gold revenues flow through Chinese and Russian banks rather than Western financial institutions. Sonabim's operations and assets are entirely on Burkinabe soil beyond Western courts' jurisdiction. Our foreign reserves are held in non-Western central banks that won't honor Western arbitration judgments. The mining companies may win every arbitration case but still collect nothing because they can't reach our assets. Even if they could seize some assets, the amounts would be tiny compared to claimed damages. Foreign companies are claiming $20 to $30 billion in total damages. Burkina Faso's seizable foreign assets might total $500 million to $1 billion. They could seize everything we have in Western jurisdictions and still recover only 2 to 5% of claimed amounts. The remaining 95 to 98% of their claims would be uncollectible judgments. The companies understand this reality, which is why their arbitration strategy focuses more on deterring other countries from nationalizing than on actually recovering value from Burkina Faso. Western governments have imposed some sanctions targeting my government and associates, including travel bans and asset freezes on individuals involved in nationalization. The sanctions are symbolic irritants rather than substantial pressure. I don't need to travel to Western countries. I visit China, Russia, Turkey, Gulf states, and other African nations where I'm welcome. My associates similarly conduct business and travel outside Western jurisdictions. Whatever assets we held in Western banks were moved before sanctions could freeze them. The personal sanctions accomplish nothing except demonstrating Western impotence when African governments act against Western interests. Broader economic sanctions against Burkina Faso have been limited because Western governments recognize that comprehensive isolation would be counterproductive. Total sanctions would harm ordinary Burkinabe citizens more than my government, creating humanitarian crisis that would generate refugee flows into neighboring countries and potentially destabilize the region. Western governments also need Burkina Faso's cooperation on counterterrorism, migration control, and other issues despite disagreements about nationalization. Comprehensive sanctions would eliminate whatever cooperation exists, so Western sanctions remain targeted and limited, insufficient to change our calculations about resource sovereignty. Other African countries will follow our example because Burkina Faso proved that nationalization succeeds despite foreign company threats and Western pressure. The demonstration effect is powerful because it addressed the fears that had previously prevented African governments from reclaiming resource sovereignty. African leaders had been told that nationalizing foreign investments would cause economic collapse, international isolation, and technical catastrophe. Burkina Faso proved all those predictions false. Our economy is growing faster under resource sovereignty. We have alternative international partnerships that prevent isolation. Our technical capacity operates mines successfully. The fears were propaganda designed to maintain exploitation, not honest assessments of actual risks. Mali announced in late 2024 that it was reviewing all mining contracts with intention of renegotiating terms or nationalizing operations that didn't provide fair value. Malian government pointed explicitly to Burkina Faso's success as model and justification. If Burkina Faso could reclaim control over gold resources, Mali could do the same with its gold and other minerals. The Malian announcement triggered alarm from mining companies operating there, including some of the same Canadian and Australian firms expelled from Burkina Faso. They recognized that pattern was forming across the Sahel. Guinea's government declared it was renegotiating all bauxite mining agreements to capture larger share of revenues from aluminum ore that currently enriched foreign companies while leaving Guinea poor despite having world's largest bauxite reserves. Guinea's president cited Burkina Faso's nationalization as inspiration and proof that African countries could control their resources. The announcement threatened major mining operations by Russian, Chinese, and Western companies that had extracted Guinea's bauxite on highly favorable terms for decades. Tanzania introduced new mining regulations requiring 16% free equity stake for government in all mining projects, plus option to acquire up to 50% ownership. The regulations effectively ended foreign majority ownership of large-scale mining operations. Tanzanian officials explicitly referenced Burkina Faso's model while explaining that Tanzania was choosing gradual approach of increasing state ownership rather than immediate full nationalization. But the direction was clear. Tanzanian resources would increasingly be controlled by Tanzanians. Zimbabwe moved toward nationalizing its diamond sector, which had been dominated by foreign companies and military-connected entities that extracted billions in diamonds, while Zimbabwe received minimal revenues. Zimbabwean government announced plans to consolidate all diamond mining under state control, similar to Burkina Faso's approach with gold. The move threatened established foreign diamond companies and controversial joint ventures that had enriched elites while providing little benefit to ordinary Zimbabweans. The Democratic Republic of Congo began reviewing cobalt and copper mining contracts that gave foreign companies control over minerals crucial to electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy technologies. Cobalt prices were rising due to green energy transition, but Congo received a small fraction of the value despite having over 70% of global cobalt reserves. Congolese officials studied Burkina Faso's nationalization strategy while calculating whether similar approach could work in Congo's more complex mining sector with larger foreign investments at stake. Zambia's government announced it was increasing mining royalties and requiring greater local ownership in copper sector. Namibia declared new terms for lithium mining as global lithium demand surged for batteries. Botswana renegotiated its diamond agreement with De Beers to increase government revenue share. South Africa intensified discussions about expanding state mining company and potentially nationalizing some operations. Across the continent, African governments were reassessing resource relationships and demanding better terms. The spreading resource nationalism created panic among Western mining companies and governments. If the trend continued, Western companies would lose control over African resources they depended on for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to industrial manufacturing. African countries controlled majority of global reserves for numerous critical minerals including cobalt, platinum, manganese, and chromium. Losing access to African resources or having to accept African control and reduced profits would fundamentally alter global supply chains and Western economic models. Mining industry conferences and publications were filled with alarmed discussions about African resource nationalism and how to counter it. Companies commissioned studies about political risk and developed strategies for managing increasingly assertive African governments. Industry associations lobbied Western governments to pressure African countries and defend investor rights. But the discussions revealed that mining companies had no effective response beyond hoping African countries would be intimidated by legal threats and Western pressure that Burkina Faso had already proven ineffective. This is what self-reliance means economically. Not depending on foreign companies to extract our resources and grant us small percentage of revenues. Not accepting that foreign investors' rights supersede our development needs. Not subordinating our economic sovereignty to international systems designed to enable continued extraction. Controlling our own natural resources and using revenues to build the schools, hospitals, roads, and industries that our people need. Self-reliance begins with resource sovereignty because countries that don't control their natural resources can never be economically independent. Foreign control over resources creates fundamental dependency where the country must accept foreign companies' terms and accommodate foreign governments' preferences to maintain access to revenues from its own resources. The dependency extends beyond economics into politics, as foreign companies and governments use resource control as leverage over domestic policies. True independence requires controlling the wealth under your own soil. Self-reliance also means developing local technical capacity to operate industries rather than permanently depending on foreign expertise. The claim that Africans lack capacity to run modern industries has been primary justification for foreign control. Companies argued they brought unique technical knowledge that Africans couldn't replicate. Burkina Faso proved that argument false. We recruited and trained local engineers. We hired African technical experts from neighboring countries. We contracted with service providers for specialized expertise without requiring foreign ownership. Within months, we operated mines as efficiently as foreign companies had. The technical capacity gap was maintained by exclusion and lack of opportunity, not by innate African deficiencies. Self-reliance requires using national wealth for national development priorities rather than enriching foreign shareholders. When mining profits flow to Toronto, London, and Sydney, they build prosperity in Canada, Britain, and Australia, while Burkina Faso remains poor despite having the gold. When mining profits stay in Burkina Faso and fund Burkinabe healthcare, education, and infrastructure, our wealth builds our prosperity. The difference between development and continued poverty is who controls the resources and where the profits flow. Self-reliance demands economic diversification so countries aren't dependent on single export commodity. Burkina Faso remains heavily dependent on gold revenues, creating vulnerability to price fluctuations and market disruptions. We're using gold revenues to invest in agricultural productivity, manufacturing capacity, and service industries that will eventually provide alternative revenue sources. The diversification will take decades, but it's happening through deliberate strategy funded by resource sovereignty. Under foreign control, mining revenues funded foreign shareholders, while Burkina Faso remained undiversified and vulnerable. Self-reliance means accessing global markets on our own terms rather than through intermediaries who capture most of the value. We sell our gold directly to Chinese, Russian, Indian, and Gulf buyers rather than through London market makers who controlled prices and charged fees. We negotiate terms based on our interests rather than accepting terms dictated by Western financial institutions. We choose partners who offer best value rather than being locked into relationships with former colonial powers. The market access reflects genuine independence rather than continued subordination. This is what African sovereignty requires fundamentally. Political independence without economic independence is hollow. Controlling our government while foreigners control our economy means limited real power over our destiny. True sovereignty requires controlling the resources under our soil, the industries operating in our territory, and the wealth generated from our labor. Resource sovereignty is prerequisite for meaningful independence. The history of post-colonial Africa demonstrates this truth painfully. Dozens of African countries achieved political independence in 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, gaining control over governments and international recognition as sovereign states. But economic control remained with former colonial powers through continued ownership of key industries, control over resources, dominance of trade relationships, and influence over currencies and financial systems. The political independence was real but limited. Former colonial powers couldn't directly govern anymore, but they controlled the economic levers that determined whether African countries prospered or failed. France maintained control over Francophone Africa through CFA franc currency, military bases, preferential trade arrangements, and French companies' dominance of key sectors. Britain maintained influence over former colonies through Commonwealth arrangements, Sterling Zone, and British companies continued control over resources. The United States expanded influence through aid relationships, military cooperation, and American companies' increasing presence. The Soviet Union during Cold War offered alternative relationships but often replicated exploitative patterns. Africans controlled our governments but didn't control our economies. The gap between political independence and economic dependence created contradictions that undermined African development. Governments could make political decisions but faced economic consequences from foreign powers who controlled resources and markets. Leaders who challenged foreign economic control faced coups, assassinations, economic strangulation, or military interventions that restored compliant governments. The sovereignty was conditional and constrained by economic dependencies that former colonial powers maintained deliberately. Burkina Faso's experience under previous governments illustrated these contradictions. We had political independence and internationally recognized sovereignty. We elected presidents, formed governments, and exercised authority over our territory. But our economy was controlled by foreign companies that extracted our gold, French companies that dominated our economy, and international financial institutions that dictated our economic policies through conditionality. Our government's actual power to improve our people's lives was limited by economic dependencies we hadn't escaped, despite political independence. Resource sovereignty breaks these dependencies by giving African governments control over the wealth that should enable development. When we control our gold, we control 20% of our GDP and over half our government revenue. That control enables economic policy autonomy because we aren't dependent on foreign aid or loans with conditions attached. It enables political autonomy because foreign governments can't threaten to cut assistance if we adopt policies they oppose. It enables development autonomy because we fund our priorities rather than implementing programs designed by foreign donors. Resource sovereignty is foundation for comprehensive sovereignty across all dimensions. This is what I achieved for Burkina Faso starting when I nationalized foreign mining companies in September 2023. The decision was condemned by Western powers and opposed by international financial institutions. The risks were significant, including potential isolation and economic collapse, but the alternative was permanent poverty while foreigners extracted our wealth. Nationalization transformed Burkina Faso from puppet state to self-reliant nation in single, bold move. The transformation wasn't guaranteed when I made the decision. The risks were real and potentially catastrophic. If Sonabim had failed to operate mines successfully, production would have collapsed and our revenues would have disappeared. If Western isolation had been complete, we would have struggled to sell gold and access the equipment and supplies mining requires. If foreign companies had successfully sabotaged operations or poisoned international opinion against us, the nationalization could have failed spectacularly. The decision was calculated risk based on careful preparation, but it was still risk. I proceeded despite risks because I calculated that the probability of success was higher than generally believed, and because the consequences of not attempting nationalization were unacceptable. The probability of success was higher than Western propaganda suggested because African technical capacity was greater than acknowledged. Alternative markets were available through China and Russia, and foreign companies' threats were often bluffs they couldn't execute effectively. The consequences of not nationalizing were permanent poverty, while foreigners extracted our wealth, continued political subordination to foreign powers who controlled our economy, and loss of respect from Burkinabe people who demanded that their government reclaim their resources. The courage to take calculated risks for national interest is what leadership requires in post-colonial Africa. Playing it safe and maintaining exploitative arrangements is easier and carries less personal risk for leaders. But it condemns populations to continued poverty and nations to continued subordination. Real leadership means challenging systems that benefit foreign interests at our expense, despite risks of international opposition. Real leaders prioritize their people's interests over maintaining comfortable relationships with foreign powers. Western powers must accept the new reality. African countries control our own resources now. We will extract them ourselves, process them ourselves, and use revenues for our own development. We will accept fair partnerships where foreign companies provide genuine services for reasonable compensation. But we will not accept exploitative arrangements where you take 90% while we receive 10%. Those days ended permanently. Your legal claims are irrelevant. Your pressure is ineffective. Your threats are hollow. Africa's resources belong to Africa now. The acceptance will be forced rather than voluntary because Western powers won't willingly surrender access to African resources that have enriched them for centuries. They'll continue pressing legal claims, imposing sanctions, threatening consequences, and attempting to prevent other African countries from following Burkina Faso's example. They'll fund studies about importance of respecting investor rights and protecting property. They'll warn about economic catastrophe from resource nationalism. They'll do everything possible to preserve exploitative system that benefits them. But the system is collapsing regardless of Western efforts because African countries have decided we would rather fight for resource sovereignty than accept continued exploitation. Burkina Faso proved it's possible to reclaim control despite Western opposition. Mali, Guinea, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and others are following our example. The momentum is building across the continent as each successful nationalization inspires others. Within a decade, foreign ownership of African resources may be exception rather than norm. Within 2 decades, complete African control may be standard across the continent. The economic transformation that will follow from continental resource sovereignty will be profound. Hundreds of billions of dollars annually that currently flow from Africa to foreign shareholders will instead fund African development. The wealth will build the schools, hospitals, roads, and industries that Africa needs to escape poverty and build prosperity. The technical capacity developed through operating our own industries will create skilled workforces and innovation ecosystems. The economic independence will enable political independence and strategic autonomy. Africa will finally be able to develop on our own terms, using our own resources for our own priorities. The nationalization of Burkina Faso's mines was one country's decision, but it represented broader African movement toward economic sovereignty and self-reliance. We are reclaiming control over resources that were stolen during colonialism and continue to be extracted under post-colonial arrangements. We are building state capacity to operate industries that foreign companies claimed only they could manage. We are using our own wealth to fund our own development rather than depending on foreign aid and investment. The transformation serves African interests even when it conflicts with Western preferences. The movement is driven by Africa's people, not just governments. Across the continent, populations are demanding that their governments reclaim resources from foreign control. They see foreign companies living in luxury while local populations remain poor. They understand that resources belong to them, but wealth flows abroad. They demand action from leaders to reclaim what's theirs. The popular pressure creates political imperative for African governments to act even when foreign pressure counsels caution. The movement is facilitated by changing global power dynamics that create alternatives to Western partnerships. China's rise as economic superpower provides alternative markets, financing, and technology that weren't available decades ago. Russia's willingness to support countries challenging Western dominance provides security and political backing. Gulf states' wealth enables investment in African development without Western conditions. India, Turkey, Brazil, and others offer additional partnership options. The multipolar world creates space for African sovereignty that didn't exist when Western powers dominated globally. The movement is sustained by demonstrated success of resource sovereignty in countries that have reclaimed control. Burkina Faso's economic transformation under Sonabim proves that African state companies can operate efficiently. Bolivia's gas nationalization proved that indigenous governments can control resources. Venezuela's oil nationalization demonstrated that resource sovereignty is achievable despite intense Western opposition. Historical examples from 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds nationalizations provide lessons about what works and what fails. Each success builds confidence and knowledge that facilitates subsequent nationalizations. France lost economic control over Burkina Faso. Canada lost mining operations. Australia lost investments. Western financial institutions lost leverage. All of you lost because you couldn't accept that African countries have right to control our own resources and use them for our own benefit. You clung to exploitative system that benefited you at Africa's expense until African countries like Burkina Faso decided we would rather fight for sovereignty than accept continued exploitation. The losses will multiply as resource nationalism spreads. French companies losing operations across Francophone Africa, Canadian mining companies expelled from multiple countries, British resource firms watching their African portfolios nationalized, Australian miners losing access to deposits they've operated for decades. The losses won't happen all at once or all the same way. Some countries will nationalize completely, like Burkina Faso. Others will renegotiate contracts for better terms. Still others will require increasing local ownership over time. But the direction is same: foreign companies losing control and African countries gaining sovereignty. The financial impact on Western companies will be substantial. African operations have been highly profitable precisely because terms were so favorable to foreign investors and exploitative of African countries. Losing those operations means losing extraordinary profits that exceeded returns available in more competitive markets. The companies will survive. Most have diversified operations globally, but their shareholders will suffer reduced returns and their growth prospects will be diminished. The era of easy profits from African resource extraction is ending. Resource nationalism is spreading because Burkina Faso proved it works. We didn't collapse. We didn't beg for foreign companies to return. We proved African technical capacity could operate modern industries. We demonstrated that alternative markets in China, Russia, and Gulf states meant we weren't dependent on Western buyers. We showed that development could be funded from African resources without Western aid. Every African country with resources controlled by foreign companies is watching and learning. The proof is concrete and measurable. Sonabim operates 9 former foreign-owned mines, producing 60 tons of gold annually, matching pre-nationalization production levels. Our operating costs are competitive with industry averages. Our revenues of $1.8 billion annually are 9 times what Burkina Faso received under foreign ownership. Our development programs, funded by mining revenues, are visible across the country in new health clinics, schools, roads, and infrastructure. The transformation from puppet state to self-reliant nation is undeniable. The learning is occurring through formal and informal channels. African government officials visit Burkina Faso to study our nationalization model. Technical experts from Sonabim consult with other African countries considering similar actions. Academic researchers analyze our experience to identify success factors and challenges. Regional organizations facilitate knowledge sharing about resource sovereignty strategies. Every African country thinking about reclaiming resource control studies Burkina Faso's experience to understand what worked, what failed, and what lessons apply to their situations.